Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me? You want to go ahead and type in the questions if you can hear me, that would be great. Or in chat. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. My name is Danny Nicholson, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for OpenStax. My colleagues Phil and Rich have put together a really interesting presentation about the science behind OpenStax Tutor Beta. So I'll go ahead and introduce them and we can get started. We do have time for about 15 minutes Q&A at the very end. So if you want to put your questions into the question feature here with GoToWebinar, we'll answer as many as we can at the end. Also, something that's important to keep in mind is that if you have any questions about using OpenStax Tutor and getting started with it, we're going to have some special webinars about that a little bit later. We're going to have some at the end of this week and then another one next week, so you can check our blog for that schedule. So I'll go ahead and get started here. The first person I want to introduce is Rich. You can see his face there in the meeting. So Rich is the founder and director of OpenStax. He started it all back in 1999. And he's also a professor of electrical engineering at Rice University. He's one of the top researchers in the world on machine learning and compressive sensing and has been conducting research in these areas for over 20 years. So I'm really glad that he was able to join us. Then we also have Phil Grimaldi, who's the director of research at OpenStax. He has a PhD in cognitive psychology from Purdue University, and his research focuses on understanding the fundamental principles of learning and memory, and then applying those principles toward improving student learning. He's been conducting research on learning for the last decade and has worked really closely with top researchers in the field. So with that, I think we can get started.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Phil and I are really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about the science behind OpenStax Tutor Beta. We're going to split the webinar into four main sections. First, I'm going to introduce our motivation for OpenStax Tutor and how it influenced our design of the platform. Then we'll dive into some of the underlying scientific issues behind OpenStax Tutor. Then we'll discuss our recommendations for how to get the most out of the tool. And finally, as Danny already noted, we'll take some questions for the audience, and we're really looking forward to those questions. So to understand OpenStax Tutor, it really helps to ground ourselves in the problems that we're trying to solve. And in particular, there are four main challenges facing the modern college student. The first major challenge is simply cost. Students face ever-increasing textbook and materials prices, and these costs have real impact on learning. In fact, many students drop or withdraw because of the course, out of courses because of these costs. Even worse, some students attempt to take a course and then fail because they decide not to purchase the materials and then basically get partway through the course and aren't able to follow or to get the help that they need. The second big challenge is the quantity of information students have to learn. Students enter college having to learn truly vast amounts of information. The common analogy that students use is it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose, and this can be very overwhelming. Even worse, students have to learn this vast amount of information in a limited amount of time. And this is especially bad for students who need to work part or full-time in order to pay for college. So the time that students do spend learning and studying, they need the time to be well spent. And finally, many students arrive at college just frankly unprepared to handle the challenge of just being a student. Very few students are actually taught how to study. They're simply told to learn the information that's presented. And as a result, many of them rely on really shallow learning strategies, things like repeated rereading of the book, highlighting, and these have been proven to be inefficient and produce only limited and short-term learning benefits. So our design of OpenStax Tutor directly addresses these four challenges using an approach that relies heavily on two fields of study, namely cognitive science and machine learning. So cognitive science is the study of the mind, and mental processes, including, very importantly, the processes involved in learning and retaining knowledge. Over the past century, cognitive science has amassed a wealth of data and theories that are directly relevant to how students process and learn information in a course. As such, it provides a really valuable framework for thinking about how to improve student learning and design tools to make sure it happens. Just as importantly, this century of results in cognitive science help us, they provide a rudder that helps steer us away from fads and pseudoscientific ideas that might make intuitive sense but actually aren't grounded in reality or in science. The second important area is machine learning. Unlike cognitive science, it's a very new field of engineering and statistics, and it involves the design of algorithms, computer algorithms that learn and make predictions from data. Machine learning is rapidly becoming ubiquitous. For example, it's the engine that enables personalized recommendation of movies on Netflix, products on Amazon, searches on Google. And machine learning is now starting to make major inroads into the education space, particularly in the design of personalized learning systems like OpenStax Tutor. So the way that we put cognitive science and machine learning together in OpenStax Tutor is that we combine them in a way that closes the learning feedback loop. And so you can think of the tutor tool as on the one hand, acquiring data from students as they go through their various learning activities, analyzing that data using machine learning algorithms that are informed by cognitive science principles, and then those machine learning algorithms are creating predictions. For example, predicting the best next learning activity for a given student who is at a given point in the class and has a certain context and learning goals. So this is the basic idea of how we combine cognitive science and machine learning in OpenStax Tutor. And now Phil is going to tell us a little bit about how we set the design goals for making the most profitable marriage of these two ideas.
Sure, thanks, Rich. So at a very high level, when we were starting to put together the main feature set for OpenStax Tutor, we decided early on that we wanted our system to be very complementary to the standard workflow for students and instructors. We're not rewriting the book, metaphorically speaking. We're working within the standard workflow. We also want to identify what are the areas that students need the most help in and tackle those areas first and provide them with known best practices that are going to produce what we consider the biggest bang for their buck. So students don't need to completely relearn how to learn and study. They just need to a little bit of guidance on what they need to do. So the entire talk today, we'll be talking mostly about the science, but it helps to sort of provide an outline for what Tutor is like, what are the main learning modes, so you can understand where we actually fit in those scientific principles. We can look at two different learning modes, teacher assignable learning modes and self-regulated learning modes. For teacher assignable actions, we split these into two basic assignment types, reading assignments and homework assignments. And hopefully these are familiar concepts to everybody, and that's by design. But rather than just pointing to students to a section of the book to read, we've supercharged reading assignments with cognitive science principles and machine learning to make them more effective. Same goes with homework assignments. Rather than just pointing students to practice problems that they need to complete, we're giving them supercharged practice problems with machine learning behind it. Learning is also, it's really important for students to self-regulate their own learning. They can't rely entirely on what the teacher provides for them. Some students might require more, or other other students might just like to engage with the material more often than others. So they need to make their own decisions for learning, and so we provide a number of avenues for students to do this. We provide a performance forecast where they can view where they are on all the different topics, and a practice widget that allows them to go in and practice certain topics. So with that, we'll now start diving into the underlying scientific principles behind OpenStax Tutor. We'll be talking about 4 main concepts today. Retrieval practice is one of our main mechanisms for improving learning in OpenStax Tutor. Space practice, segmented readings, and metacognition, and we'll go into detail for each of those. We'll start off talking about retrieval practice. First, it's worth talking about what is retrieval. In traditional learning theory, we distinguish between 2 main phases of learning, encoding and retrieval phases. Education is more or less focused a lot of the time on encoding processes. How do you improve a lecture or a book reading, or how do we find the next greatest video to show students to improve their learning? And retrieval is the process by which you then just recover the information that you learned during encoding, so like what happens on a test. We commonly view retrieval mostly as a neutral process, and all the real action is happening during encoding. Of course, that's not true at all, and that's not how the mind works. When we retrieve information from knowledge, it's actually a highly active reconstructive process, and every time you retrieve knowledge, you're actively changing it and making that knowledge more robust and applicable to new situations. So we refer to retrieval practice as the act of retrieving information as a form of study activity. So engaging in self-testing, or answering flashcard questions, or engaging in discussion, all forms of retrieval practice. Now, there's a lot of research demonstrating that retrieval practice is a particularly potent way of studying information and learning information. And there's lots of research on this. I'll talk about one study today that I really like by Karpicki and Blunt in 2011. I really like this study because they compare retrieval practice to a popular encoding strategy known as concept mapping, which would be a pretty quintessential elaborative encoding strategy where students are organizing information on a page, drawing connections among these things, identifying the relationships, a lot of relational, organizational processing going on in concept mapping. And what they did is they compared retrieval practice to this concept mapping condition and a repeated study condition where students reread a text over and over again, and another condition where they just read it one time. And what the data that I'm showing you on the screen here is performance on a test that occurred 1 week after originally learning the materials, according to what learning activity they used. And we see that retrieval practice outperformed all other groups on measures of verbatim recall, which would be like low-level recall of facts, and also on inference questions, which require drawing connections among different parts of the text, so a little bit higher level, meaningful learning. Again, so this is just one example of many. The real interesting thing about retrieval practice is, despite its potency, students appear more or less metacognitively blind to this effect. They do not believe that is that effective of an encoding strategy, or I'm sorry, not an encoding strategy, but a learning strategy. And as a result, they don't typically engage in this practice on their own. Instead, they prefer to use more shallow strategies like rereading, even though, as we just saw, it's not that effective of a strategy. So for that reason, if we're trying to make the biggest bang for the buck, it makes sense to target retrieval practice as a mechanism for improving learning. So if students aren't already doing this, let's get them doing retrieval practice. And so we feature retrieval heavily throughout OpenStax Tutor Beta, and dive a little bit more into how we do that. One basic question with implementing retrieval is, what format should you use? So we can ask students questions as a way of prompting them to retrieve information, which would be a pretty standard approach. But there are a number of ways you could structure the question. Should we make it a multiple choice format or a short answer format? Intuitively, it would make sense that a short answer format would produce more learning than multiple choice. multiple choice, a lot of the time students can rely on just basic recognition processes. They can look at the options, just pick out an answer, or deduce what the probable best answer is, and then make a selection. Whereas with a short answer format question, you're only given the question, minimal cue support, and you have to then construct and generate a question from memory without lots of information and cues to go off of. So there has been some research on this. Here's one example by Butler and Roediger in 2007. They compared students learning with short answer questions to multiple choice questions and two other control conditions, and they found that students recalled more on a later exam when they practiced with short answer than multiple choice. So in this case, it would seem that the intuitive belief makes sense. Short answer questions seem better than multiple choice. However, this literature is decidedly murky, and sometimes there's been other studies. I've shown one here by Little et al., where they found that in some cases multiple choice questions can be more beneficial than short answer questions. And a lot of times it just depends on how you structure the lore items in the multiple choice. It also seems to depend on whether or not you get feedback after short answer questions. So there's a lot of different edge cases and boundary conditions for this effect. So what do you actually do in this type of scenario? What we've done is we've decided to implement what we call a hybrid two-step answer format. And this hybrid format was developed by a guy named Park in 2005. And the way that this works is it's essentially taking short answer questions in multiple choice and smooshing them together. So you get, for each question, you first get it presented in the form of a short answer question. You type in a response to your short answer question, you submit, and then after that, you get the multiple choice options. This way, we have the benefit of both short answer and multiple choice. It's a little bit different than what students are used to at first, but they do get used to it, and presumably we get the benefit of both of these things. We have done a little bit of research in-house on our short answer two-step format questions. We examined basically the quality of responses that students give with the short answer questions. We did start observing that a lot of times students will, instead of answering in a meaningful response into the response box, they'll just enter in gobbledygook or garbage so that they can just jump right ahead to the multiple choice. So then we plotted, or we examined what's the likelihood of them recalling a similar question later on as a function of how many meaningful responses that they give to a particular topic. And here we're just showing a model fit line for the number of times they answer a valid response and the probability of correct future. And here we see a nice positive trend. And we've corrected for overall levels of performance. So it's not just students who know more, give more valid responses. This is any student who just gives a meaningful attempt. Even if it's wrong, this benefits their learning later on. So another question that we might ask is which questions should we actually give students during retrieval practice? So in OpenStax Tutor, there's a huge bank of questions for each book that you'll have to choose from. Which questions should you actually give your students? From an automated perspective, we can think, well, we can't necessarily give all questions to every student. We need to give them only a subset of questions. So which questions should we give them? Presumably, some questions would be more effective for some students, and other questions would be more effective for other students. So one basic idea in cognitive science that lends some relevance to this issue is this idea of desirable difficulties. And this is the idea that learning activities should be difficult but not too difficult. It's like a Goldilocks principle. But of course, difficulty is a function of the difficulty of the item, the intrinsic difficulty of the question, but also the proficiency level of the student. And so you need to consider both of these when choosing the correct question to give. And the way that we do that is with a machine learning algorithm called SPARFA, and I'll turn it over to Rich to explain how we personalize retrieval practice based on difficulty of items.
Yeah, so thanks Phil. So this diagram gives us a general idea of how one of our key machine learning algorithms, the one that we call SPARFA, or it stands for Sparse Factor Analysis, works. The algorithm takes data from all students using the system. In particular, it finds out whether they responded to a given question and whether they answered that question correctly or incorrectly. It then analyzes that data to make some very useful predictions, some of which are the difficulty of each question, how each question relates to the foundational concepts in the course. So both of these predictions tell us about how the content is organized. And then thirdly, very relevant for today's discussion, how well each student understands each of those core or foundational concepts. So the key thing is that, or summarizing that, SPARFA provides us with an estimate of the difficulty of a particular question, not in general or in aggregate over all students, but for each individual particular student. So this enables us to select an appropriately difficult student, or appropriately difficult question for the individual student. And here's an example of how we do this in a reading assignment in order to close this learning feedback loop. So first, a student reads a selection from the text, and then SPARFA updates its estimates about that particular student's proficiency level of each concept and chooses an appropriate question for the student to solve. The student then answers the question, and the outcome, whether they get it correct or incorrect, is fed back into SPARFA to update its parameters about that student. And then SPARFA selects the next question, and so on. So the end result is that this closed feedback loop enables students to receive questions that are personalized exactly to their level of proficiency. Back to Phil.
Great. All right. So the next basic idea that we'll be talking about is spaced retrieval practice. And put simply, this refers to when we take retrieval practice on a topic and we distribute it over time rather than massing it into a single learning episode. So we're still spending the same amount of time overall practicing retrieval of a topic, but rather than doing it all at once, we split it out over time. The literature on spacing is quite old, and it's a very robust and reliable effect. When you distribute learning over time, it produces more learning, better long-term retention than when you mass it into a single episode. Here's one example from Rohrer and Taylor in 2006. They had students practice retrieval in 2 separate episodes separated by a week. That's the space condition, or in a massed condition where they learned practice all of the problems in one single episode, and then they brought them back for a final assessment later on, either 1 week or 4 weeks later. And here we're just plotting accuracy on that assessment. After 1 week, students in the mass condition had a slight advantage over students in the space condition. This is not that meaningful of a difference here. However, after a 4-week retention interval, here we see a big difference. The spaced condition is actually performing twice as good as the massed practice condition. And so we see that when you engage in spaced retrieval practice, it improves long-term retention over time. So you might not see those effects immediately, but if you wait a little bit, now students are retaining that information a lot longer. Now, we've known about spacing for decades, but it's rarely used in education. Part of the reason for that is it's just difficult to do. It takes time to actually go through your schedule and schedule repetitions of information. It's hard for students to do this on their own. There's starting to be more and more technology, however, being developed to implement spacing. And so this seems like a natural way for us to improve learning. This is not something that people are already doing, so it's an easy win. And here's how we do it in OpenStax Tutor Beta. What we do is for all assignments, reading assignments or homework assignments, we reserve slots at the end of each assignment for us to fill with tutor-selected questions. So for example, here's 4 assignments over time, and they're color-coded according to which topic they might represent. On the first assignment, you only practice topic A. On the second assignment, you practice topic B, but then we fold in a question from topic A. And so we remind the student about what they learned previously. Then on assignment 3, they learn a new topic, topic C, and we fold in a question from topic B. And as they continue going on, they continue getting more questions from previously learned topics over time. Important thing here is that the topics and questions are personalized to the student. So we select each question and the tutor selected questions according to the student's proficiency levels. And we personalize it according to the order in which students learn things. So the algorithm scales itself to the order in which you assign things, the order in which students complete the activities. So the spacing is entirely scaled and personalized to the student. The next principle we'll talk about is segmented readings. And segmenting simply refers to the process of breaking up large content into smaller user-paced segments. This dates back to old literature on cue overload, which simply shows that as you add more and more information to a single learning episode, the probability of learning any one piece of information decreases, regardless of how much students actually know. It essentially amounts to overloading the student. You can only learn so much information at any given time. So if you can split things up and segment them, it improves learning. If you add retrieval practice into the mix, so you segment the readings up into shorter chunks, add retrieval practice in between each chunk, this is an especially potent combination. Here's a nice empirical example of this by Wispin, Pick, and Rawson. They had students read long texts, and they broke the text up into small chunks, segmented them, and they either added retrieval practice or they did not. And this is what the condition they're calling interim test is. So those dark gray bars amounts to essentially getting retrieval practice, and the light gray bars means no retrieval practice. And what they're plotting is the amount of the text they were able to recall later on. And when you got that interim text, they were recalling approximately twice as much information of the passage. So again, particularly potent way of improving learning of a text passage. The last thing we'll talk about, last scientific concept we'll talk about, is this idea of metacognition. So anytime a student is learning on their own, they need to engage in 2 fundamental processes. They need to monitor how much they know, so figuring out which concepts they're struggling with, which ones they're good on, and then they need to make decisions about what they should do about that. Do they need to study the areas that they're weak on more? What action are they going to take, or what type of study strategy are they going to use? We know from a lot of research that students have difficulty monitoring what they do and what they do not know. A lot of times they are overconfident in their learning. They think that they've mastered a concept when they actually haven't. And this leads to bad control decisions. It means they discontinue studying when they probably should have continued studying after all. They also have difficulty choosing, which strategy do they actually want to use. A lot of students have difficulty understanding which strategy is most effective, and so they typically choose ineffective learning strategies. And so I'll turn it over to Rich to talk about how we're using machine learning to help students overcome some of their difficulties monitoring their learning.
Thanks, Phil. Rather than leaving students on their own to rely entirely on their error-prone metacognitive judgments, we can use machine learning to provide them with much more objective estimates of their understanding and progress through a course. So using the SPARFA machine learning algorithm I talked about earlier, we can predict how well a student understands each of the foundational concepts in a course. And one really useful way to think of this is like a student having a student comprehension profile that is much more informative than a grade. For example, rather than simply telling Susan that she has a B in the course so far, we can provide her with a 5-dimensional profile that tells her how well she's doing on certain topics, for example, 1 and 4, and whether she's struggling at others. Here, for example, number 3. Moreover, because SPARFA has organized the course's questions according to how they relate to the foundational concepts, OpenStax Tutor can automatically direct students to optimize questions that have 2 properties. First, they deal exactly with the concepts that she needs to practice, and 2, they're of just the right level of difficulty for her to get the most out of that practice. So that's the algorithmics behind personalized practice. The way that we implement this in OpenStax Tutor is to take the output of our SPARFA and other machine learning algorithms and display these results on a performance forecast page. This page enables students to view their relative levels of success on each of the topics in the course, and very importantly, it gives them an action that they can perform. So if they click on any of the performance indicator bars, then a practice widget is launched, and that practice widget enables students to practice retrieval on that precise topic. Again, closing that learning feedback loop. Thus, we're able to get students additional information for them to monitor their learning and for them to practice on the areas that they're struggling. Back to Phil.
Okay, so to wrap up, I'm just going to go over some of our recommendations for getting the most out of OpenStax Tutor. We've had the benefit of working closely with a number of instructors over the last year who have been using OpenStax Tutor, and we picked up a lot of learnings and best cases, what works and what doesn't work. And I'd like to share some of those learnings with you. One question that you might have is when to assign readings and homework assignments. We recommend leveraging the reading assignments as a primer leading up to a class meeting. So for every class meeting, I recommend giving a reading assignment covering that material prior to the class meeting. This will get students primed and ready to receive kind of the higher level information that you might be wanting them to pick up in class. So this works well for standard lecture courses. It also works well for flipped classrooms if you do some kind of discussion meeting class. It gets students ready to discuss the material. And lastly, after the class meeting, follow up with a homework assignment. And the homework assignments will reinforce some of the concepts that you went over in the class meeting. Some general tips for creating the assignments. Lots of short assignments are preferable to a few really long ones. So you could, if you wanted to, create one big reading assignment that has 4 chapters in it. I would highly recommend that instead you split that up into 8 or 9 shorter assignments. For the same reasons that I discussed before. You don't want to overload the students because that it decreases the learning that they might receive because you're overloading them. And also you want to give tutor the opportunity to space out those materials. So if you include lots of short assignments, there'll be more spaced practice. They'll retain that information for longer. You should allow as many tutor-selected problems as possible. We do provide you with the ability to turn up or down how many tutor-selected problems you want. That essentially determines how much spaced practice they'll get. If you want them to retain the information for longer, you use more tutor-selected practice problems. However, if you need to balance the amount of time that students spend, that's a decision that's up to you to make. I do recommend giving a small amount of course credit, and that's preferable to making use of the tool optional. We've learned that classes that use the tool optionally essentially get very little usage, and students can't benefit from the learning benefits of OpenStax Tutor if they don't actually use it. Some broader tips, I do recommend emphasizing the importance of practicing retrieval and learning. And by that I mean let students know that when they're answering questions, they should be doing it from memory, and that it's okay to get questions wrong. They don't need to get every question right, and they're not necessarily being assessed, especially when they're doing the reading assignments. The point is to get them actively involved in retrieval. Getting something wrong is better than not having tried to recall it at all. I do recommend reviewing the free-form responses. So their tutor does give you the opportunity to go in and review the freeform responses and let students know that you are looking at them. If students think that their responses are just going into the void, then eventually they'll just start typing in gobbledygook, and that's all you'll get. And that's not going to benefit them at all. I do recommend using the provided metrics to understand how your class is doing. So if you lead your class period with a reading assignment, you can see which types of questions your class is getting wrong, and you can adjust discussion in the class accordingly. We did have several instructors who would actually go over some of the metrics with their class after the assignment was due, and she found that to be very beneficial. Some final points, of course, results are always going to vary. Classes are a lot different, student compositions are different, each class has different requirements. So if you have a question about, or you think your class might be unique in some way, we do encourage you to reach out to us, to me in particular, and I'd be happy to have a chat with you and we could talk about how a tutor might be best utilized in your class. And lastly, the research on all of this continues. We're using the latest research findings, but things might come out that might question our approach, in which case we will adjust accordingly. And we're continually conducting research on all of our features as we collect data. And as we develop and test new features, we'll be improving Tutor as we go along. So we do thank you for your interest in using OpenStax Tutor, and know that ultimately this will benefit our understanding of how people learn. We'll publish those findings, and eventually that new knowledge will make its way to lots of other students. Provided a reference list if you're interested in following up and reading any of the studies that we mentioned here today. And with that, we can turn over to Danny, who's collected a lot of the different questions that you've been asking, and we can try and answer as many of those in the time remaining that we have.
Yeah, so I would also like to introduce Kim Jones-Davenport. She's also joined us as a panelist here. Kim is the product manager for OpenStax Tutor, so I think she'll also be a great resource for us as we go through these questions. The first question is, how can you decide short answer questions are more useful? If yes, then why?
So I'm not sure exactly what the question is asking. So we can speak broadly whether or not short answer questions are more useful. I'm wondering if the person asking the questions or whether or not we decide if we should ask a question in terms of a short answer format or a multiple choice question, in which case we don't really distinguish among these cases here. We just give the two-step hybrid format whenever we can. In this way, we sort of are guaranteed that if the question is more beneficial as a short answer format, well, we still present it as a short answer question. If the question is more beneficial as a multiple choice, they still get the multiple choice format. So we sort of skirt the issue there. In terms of a research question, you know, there are various techniques for determining which are more effective, but we're not actively conducting that research. But you would want to do an experiment where you manipulate whether or not students get a short answer question or a multiple choice question.
Thanks, Phil. So our second question is, I guess this comes from someone who used probably Concept Coach or maybe OpenStax Tutor in a pilot. And they said that last semester I saw that many students simply type nonsense, for example, AA to go to the multiple choice question. Is the essay entry somehow analyzed? Sure.
So yes, this is something that we are very aware of, and we've been conducting research examining the effectiveness of you know, what happens when a student types in nonsense. Do they learn the material better? And I did show you the example of, we do have some preliminary results showing that yes, when students enter in meaningful responses, they learn the material better. Is it analyzed? We've been doing a lot of research with various natural language processing techniques where we can automatically examine those responses. And we've gotten really good at a process that we call garbage detection. And that essentially allows us to detect whether or not a short answer response is that gobbledygook, nonsense response, and we can detect that with about 95% accuracy. Right now, we do not have that implemented in Tutor. Long term, in the next maybe half a year, we do plan on implementing some new feature that will allow us to give feedback to the instructor and the student to let them know that yes, we've noticed that they've typed in garbage and we've taken note of it. And in the meantime, I would highly recommend that instructors review those responses, and if you detect a student is typing in a lot of nonsense, to intervene.
Okay, so the next question is, this seems to be oriented to factual learning recall only. What are the implications for more creative mastery of subjects?
So, on the contrary, we actually use a variety of different question types. So we have a large pool of questions that we ask students, and they're all tagged according to a level of Bloom's taxonomy. So while we do, yes, have questions that are oriented towards low-level factual recall, we also have questions that ask students to apply the knowledge to novel learning domains that taps synthesis of information. So we aren't just tapping low-level recall, and so yeah, there's opportunities there for improving a higher-level understanding.
Okay. So our next question is, how do you assess effectiveness of prediction when recommended items are different for each student?
That is a really interesting question. Predictions. Yeah. Go ahead, and I'll follow up with what you.
Well, the really powerful thing about the kind of machine learning algorithms we're using, the SPARFA algorithm in particular, is that it can we can basically, by considering not just the estimation of the difficulty of a question, thinking about or inferring or making predictions about how strongly each of the foundational concepts or topics in the course play a role in that given question. That allows us to basically help calibrate the difficulty of questions that a student has not even answered, because they will have answered other questions that will that we will be able to link to that given question through through this context that we have set up. So Phil, maybe you want to add more to that.
Sure, and the other thing to keep in mind too with regards to prediction accuracy, the fact of the matter is you actually improve your prediction accuracy when you give students different items. So for example, certain questions, if a really advanced student is given a question and a medium level student is given the same question, if the highly advanced student gets that question right, it really doesn't provide you with all that much information about where that student is at. In fact, if you want to learn more information about a student's proficiency level, you want to scale the questions to where they're at approximately a 50-50 level chance of getting that correct. This is essentially what adaptive tests do, like the GRE. They're constantly picking questions that give the most information about a particular student. So everybody's getting different questions, but the algorithm is actually picking up more meaningful information about that student. So yeah, it's actually better for prediction accuracy to give different items.
Okay. So our next question is, I'm interested in trying OpenStax Tutor Beta with a high school biology class where the course textbook is not OpenStax. How could OpenStax Tutor Beta be integrated into a pre-existing course which might be using a non-OpenStax reading material? So first of all, unfortunately, OpenStax Tutor Beta isn't going to be available for high school courses this year, but it is something that we're looking into for the future. Right now, our terms of use and payment processes are just not set up for high school courses right now. But otherwise, I will defer to Phil, unless Kim, you'd like to jump in and answer this one.
Sure. I'll just add that for college users, it is possible to integrate OpenStax Tutor Beta into a course that's using a different book. I do think there may be some challenges if your textbook doesn't align exactly. You would of course have to go into OpenStax Tutor, look at the content, look at the exercises, and select questions that are applicable for your course. So that's how I'd answer that.
Okay. So the next question is, what's the main difference between OpenStax Tutor and the discontinued Concept Coach? Kim, would you like to take that one also?
Sure. So if you've used Concept Coach, it's similar in that it allows you to see how your students are performing on questions that they answer while they're reading. But OpenStax Tutor Beta goes farther than that. It lets you assign reading and assign homeworks to your students, and it lets you add due dates and open dates, which you didn't have in Concept Coach. So you have a calendar, and you can make those available to students when you want them to have it. In addition, OpenStax Tutor it leverages these machine learning algorithms that Rich was talking about. So this allows us to give personalized questions to students tailored to those individual students. Other high points, you have better and more detailed analytics on an assignment level and on a student level. You also, students can practice independently with OpenStax Tutor Beta. They have the option to see places where they might be lacking or not performing as well, and they can go and practice independently, which we didn't have in Concept Coach. And it also takes into account 4 semesters of pilots that we've had with OpenStax Tutor Beta to really help us identify and fix major bugs and usability issues.
Great. Thanks, Kim.
Sure.
So we have another question here that I think we're going to have to get some more information about. So the next question is, how do you design concept groups, the dimensions in your assessment? If you could please just add some more information, maybe in the chat, to help us answer that question a little bit better. So then we'll move on to the next question, I guess, while you're adding your information. This next question is, expand on what your concept of homework is. Practice, summative assessment.
Yeah, that's a good question. It would probably depend on how exactly you want to use the homework. It's essentially, I prefer to think of it like a formative assessment. If you would like to use it as a summative assessment, you could conceivably do that. We actually had several instructors that used it as a summative assessment. I think a formative assessment, it would be perfectly fine to envision that way. Where it might get a little bit murky is that because of the spaced practice and personalized learning elements of the homework assignments, there will definitely be some personalized elements to it. So students will get some of the same questions, particularly the questions that you get. However, they'll also get personalized questions that are unique or uniquely chosen for them. So its functionality as a summative assessment is a little limited. So I would think formative assessment would be fine. Okay.
So the next question is, how does this work in the asynchronous online environment, self-directed environments like MOOCs?
I'll try to answer this. With respect to MOOCs, you could certainly use it within a MOOC, although the MOOCs I've seen that the questions are sort of integrated directly into edX or whatever. So in our case, you would link students out to work the assignments outside of the MOOC, but there's no reason you couldn't do that. We have direct assignment links that you could add to your LMS or to your MOOC, and students would just enroll separately and work those within our system.
Thanks, Kim. So the next question is probably also for you, Kim. Is OpenStax Tutor separate from the textbooks?
So it is separate from the textbooks. I do want to highlight, you can absolutely, if you're already using the textbook, you can continue using the textbook with or without adopting OpenStax Tutor Beta. And if you're using a partner, you can continue using those partners as well. If you adopt OpenStax Tutor, it will come with the e-textbook or the digital textbook integrated within Tutor. Hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please post and we'll try to get to that later.
Yeah. And just to add to that, we have many different technology partners that provide online homework and different adaptive learning tools that integrate with our books. And so those are all listed on our website, and we're happy to have that many choices that go with our books, and you're welcome to use, of course, whichever one you see is being the best fit for your class.
Right.
So the next question is OpenStax Tutor available for math courses? This is the first I've heard about it, so I have a lot to learn.
So right now, I'll take this one. Right now, we're only available for Intro to Sociology 2E, College Physics, and Biology. I think, like with our other books, we started with a small number of books and then expanded, and we're hoping to do the same thing with OpenStax Tutor Beta, but no math courses right now.
Okay, thanks, Kim. The next question is other methods to reduce testing as an assessment of student learning?
Right, so how do you undo years of having testing viewed as an assessment? I would say one successful way that we've seen to do this is to offer completion credit for assignments instead of performance credit. So emphasize the role of just simply engaging in those processes over getting everything right. Beyond that, we're exploring different ways of doing this and looking into different motivational elements that we might be able to build into the system that hopefully we'll be able to learn better answers to this question, but that's the best I can offer at this time.
Can I add one thing to that, Phil?
Sure, go ahead.
So as Phil mentioned, we have been piloting this with some pilot instructors across the country, and I will say they've come up with some interesting ways to incentivize students to care a little bit more about learning the material versus just the score that they did. So we are doing these pioneer webinars where we'll be talking about some of those best practices. One of them is, they use the analytics to identify questions that really revealed some major misconception and focused on that in the classroom as a way to sort of build on, okay, you spent this time doing this, now let's think about what this really means for your learning. So I think there are some implementation techniques that you can use to sort of leverage a system based on questions while still emphasizing what you care about, which is mastery of the content.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Okay, so it looks like we are out of time. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of these questions. We are considering hosting another webinar like this, covering the same topic, maybe sometime in September or late August. So if there's interest for that, please email us and let us know your thoughts. Also, we can look over these questions and probably put the answers into a blog post if Phil and Rich and Kim are okay with that.
Sure.
So make sure to get all your questions answered. We will also have, like Kim just mentioned and like I mentioned at the beginning, we will have other webinars about actually using the tool and best practices and how to get your students started and things like that. So check our blog for that. Those are all listed out at multiple times over the next several weeks. So I guess we're all done. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.